Welcome back to the final episode of our captivating series, A Short History of Pre-Islamic Spain. In this video, we embark on an enlightening journey through the annals of history, summarizing the rich tapestry of Spain's past from its earliest inhabitants until the reign of the Visigoth king Roderick, or Don Rodrigo. As we uncover the intertwined stories of the diverse cultures that make up modern Spain, we challenge the biased narratives that have shaped many people's understanding of Spain's history to show that the Muslims were indeed a part of the fabric of Spanish society before the Reconquista. We want to show that the Muslims were not just Arabs and Berbers that occupied Hispania, but in fact, many of the people of the land became integral to Islamic history in Al-Andalus. Since the Reconquista and well into the 1940s, there has been a push to distance Spain's past with its Islamic heritage. Spanish historians, like Claudio Sanchez Albornoz, tried to argue that Muslims were just Arab invaders to a European country with a flourishing civilization in their invasion in the 8th century. In his book on the Spaniards, he writes that Spanish are a race rooted in Roman and Visigothic civilization, and that Islam plays no role in the buildup of Spanish identity, but they're only invaders from Arab lands. This premise was debated vehemently by other Spanish historians, notably Americo Castro, who had argued that Muslims are an integral part of Spanish identity. Professor Karen de Villa sums up the appropriate response when she said, "The Arab invasion is only a myth, and Al-Andalus was in its majority composed of natives of the Iberian Peninsula and not Arabs." So what is the truth behind the Muslim history of Spain? Were the Muslims just Arab and Berber invaders, while Spanish history and identity is truly native Roman and Visigoth? Weren't the Romans and Visigoths themselves also invaders of the land of Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula? Our story began when the Iberian Peninsula was home to a mosaic of early inhabitants. The Celts, the Iberians, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Cantabrians, the Greeks, they all left their indelible mark on the land. From as early as the 9th century BC until the arrival of the Romans in the 2nd century BC, these various societies and peoples flourished, shaping the foundations of what would become modern Spain. One group never ruled the entirety of the land. In fact, they often fought one another in tribal disputes and in fierce rivalries over land and resources. They didn't share a common culture or religion, or even a common language. With the arrival of the Romans, a new chapter unfolded. From the 2nd century BC to the 5th century, in the Common Era, the Roman Empire left an indomitable imprint on the peninsula. The Romans brought governance, infrastructure, and most importantly, Latin, which became the lingua franca of the region. They integrated local customs and traditions, blending their own cultural practices with those of the indigenous people, making them Hispano-Romans. Following the fall of the Roman Empire, new powers emerged. The 5th to the 8th centuries in the Common Era witnessed the arrival and the reign of Gothic tribes from Germania, the Vandals, the Alans, the Suevi. These Germanic tribes, while initially outsiders, eventually integrated into the fabric of Hispania, contributing to its evolving society. Then the Visigoths took center stage, from the early 5th century in the Common Era until the first decade of the 8th century. They ruled over Hispania. The Visigoths, with their Arian Christian faith, established their kingdoms and left an enduring legacy on the region. Their rule saw a blending of Roman administrative structures with Gothic customs, creating a unique synthesis of cultures. The Visigoth Arian Christians had initially oppressed and subjugated the Catholics and the Sephardic Jews of the region, until the kings began to adopt Catholicism as their denomination, although they continued to oppress the Jewish population in Hispania. When they realized that they couldn't continue to rule with divided citizenry, they introduced laws that normalized the relations between the Hispano-Romans and the Visigoths, allowing intermarriage and integration. Now it is essential to address a prevalent misconception. The Muslim presence in Spain, which began in the year 711 in the Common Era, is often portrayed as foreign and invasive. However, when we examine the timeline, we realize that the Muslim presence lasted for nearly 7 centuries, from the 8th century until the late 15th century. Comparatively, the other peoples that had occupied Spain for similar durations are often described as being the rightful inhabitants or inheritors of Spain. It is crucial to recognize that the Muslim presence in Spain is not an isolated episode, but it is an integral part of the diverse tapestry that shapes modern Spain. The depiction of Islam and Muslims as mere foreign invaders is biased, it's dishonest, and it's an oversimplification of the complex layers that comprise Spain's heritage. This pervasive myth goes so far as to leave Muslims out completely in many classrooms in the West, leaving many people ignorant and oblivious to just how long Islam and the Muslims were present in the region and prevalent in the culture and the heritage of modern-day Spain. It is this type of alienation of Muslim history in Al-Andalus that results in many people being ignorant of the fact that large portions of Spain was essentially a Muslim land for centuries. This is not a recent phenomenon. The Spaniards of the Reconquista intentionally divided the society into Old Christians and Moriscos, who were Muslims that had converted to Christianity by force in order to remain in Spain, and the Conversos, the Jews that were forced to convert to Christianity in order to remain in Spain. The alienation and separation of Islam and Muslims from Spanish history was driven by a view that these Christians were the true inheritors and descendants of the early Spanish peoples, while the Muslims and the Jews were outsiders with different lineages and not worthy of being considered Spaniards or true natives of the region. This is why the Moriscos and Conversos could never really be considered truly Spanish, because they lacked what was called the limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood, even though there were Muslim and Jewish presence in Hispania for hundreds of years. The Spanish used the term Moor or Moro to refer to Arab and North African descendancy, summarized generally as Muslim, denying them the right to be considered people of that land. Meanwhile, some areas of Al-Andalus had Muslim rule longer than the Roman Empire had ruled for just under 7 centuries. One inquisitor by the name of Jimenez de Reynoso even drew parallels of the war between the Romans and the Carthaginians to expelling Muslims from Spain. He even brought up the Visigoth expulsion of the Jews as a precedent to say that Muslims don't belong here. In the course of our studies on the history of Al-Andalus, a statement from the British academic, Professor Elizabeth Drayson, stood out to us. She said, "After an 800-year presence in this country, the right of these people to consider themselves native Spaniards was undermined by a new Catholic regime. Their cultural and religious customs were condemned, and they were finally forced to leave their homeland. This was an act equivalent to making all English people descended from Norman French leave the British Isles, never to return." Clearly, the Spaniards viewed Muslims as outsiders who don't belong in Spain, and as a foreign and obscure part of the history of Spain. We challenge this narrative that the Muslims were not native to this land. It assumes that the Muslims in Al-Andalus were predominantly Arabs and Berbers from North Africa that solely ruled over reluctant natives who only accepted Islam by force or coercion. This is an absurd idea, considering that forced conversions are not acceptable in Islam. The truth is, the natives who accepted Islam mostly did so out of belief and not coercion. There is no real evidence to state otherwise. There, of course, may be isolated incidents, but it's clearly not the majority. Some may have done so seeking worldly benefits, but the reality is that this is just an assumption that some people make because of a handful of instances that are reported. Many of the Arabs and Berbers integrated with the people who were there. They married and had children. Many of those children who had become Muslim had significant contributions to Islamic society. The idea that Muslims forced conversions upon their entry to Al-Andalus is baseless. Take the example of Ziyad ibn Nabih at-Tamimi, who married a Christian woman who was a daughter of one of the Visigoth nobles. We know that she remained a Christian and she was not forced to become Muslim because she swore by the religion of the Messiah when she spoke to him. showing that she maintained her Christianity, as Muslims are allowed to marry Christian and Jewish women because they are considered people of the book. Ibn al-Faradi names a scholar who died in the year 388 Hijri, or the year 998 in the Common Era, around 277 years after the Muslims entered Hispania. His name was Ahmed bin Sulaiman bin Ayyub bin Sulaiman bin Hakam bin Abdullah ibn al-Balkayish ibn Ilyan, or Julian, al-Quti, the Visigoth. 6 generations of Muslims with Visigoth lineage. A Muslim scholar from Cordoba. His father was a friend and a companion and student of Baqi bin Makhlad, and he had narrated from him. In his biography, Ibn al-Faradi recorded that his grandfather, Julian, had accepted Islam when the Muslims were victorious in Al-Andalus. This is the same Julian of Sueda, or Septa, the Visigoth governor that aided the Muslims in entering Al-Andalus. His son Balkayish was a Muslim, and it is very likely that Julian accepted Islam, but we don't have any real confirmation at this time of whether he became Muslim before or after the victory in Al-Andalus. There are so many examples of this that simply refute the idea that some people push that the natives reluctantly accepted Islam to avoid paying the jizya or for discrimination. Just look at how some of the Visigoths rose to prominence in the Arabic language. Hardly the behavior of a people who were forced to accept Islam and the culture of the Arabs. Muhammad ibn Umar al-Ishbili, meaning that he was from Seville, he was originally from Cordoba or Cordoba. He was known as Abu Bakr al-Lughawi, meaning the linguist, and Nahawi, the grammarian. He was proficient in the Arabic language, in grammar, and poetry, and literature. Yaqut al-Hamawi says about him that he was the most knowledgeable in his time regarding the Arabic language. He was a scholar and a jurist, well versed in the transmission of hadith and in narrations. He is famously known as Ibn al-Qutiyya, meaning that he was the son of a Visigoth, but not just any Visigoth. His great-grandfather, Ibrahim, his mother, meaning Ibrahim's mother, Sarah, was the daughter of Almond, the son of King Witiza, the famous king of the Visigoths before King Roderick. She sought help and refuge in the Levant and petitioned the Khalifa, Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, to intervene because her uncle, Ardadas, or Ardabas, was oppressing her and taking her rightful land from her. While she was there, she had married Isa ibn Mazahim. They had both returned to Al-Andalus. Her descendants were famously ascribed to her name, showing that the honor that she had received from the Muslims and the Muslim society. Ibn al-Qutiyya, who died in the year 367 Hijri, equivalent to 977 in the Common Era, also wrote a history of the victory of the Muslims in Al-Andalus, which is known as Tarikh Iftitah Al-Andalus. One of the most prominent, and actually the oldest Muslim judge in Al-Andalus, was Al-Qadi Mehdi bin Muslim. Al-Khushani, the author of Qulat Qurtuba, noted that he was a son of a revert of Al-Andalus. He was placed in charge of Qurtuba and the affairs of Qurtuba by Uqba bin al-Hajjaj as-Saluli during the fight that he had had between the Franks beyond the Pyrenees. This was a few decades after the Muslims had entered Hispania. We can see just how integrated the Goths and the Hispano-Roman population was with the Muslim society by just looking at the lineage and the names of some of the notable scholars and figures of Al-Andalus. For example, Garcia is not an Arabic nor a Berber name, but we find many scholars from Al-Andalus that show their indigenous roots far from being merely foreign invaders from Arabia and North Africa. Ibn Garcia al-Qurtubi, or Ibn Garcia al-Qurtubi, was a notable scholar and a judge in Al-Andalus. He was a scholar in the Maliki madhab. Ibn Hayyan said about him, "There was no one like him in his time." Ibn Hazm said that he was the most knowledgeable person in the madhab of Imam Malik that he had met. Another example is the famous ascetic, who was renowned for his piety in Al-Andalus, Abu al-Qasim Abdul Aziz bin Umar bin Abdul Aziz bin Garcia, the son of Garcia. Ahmed bin Garcia was another well-known figure in Al-Andalus. There are so many examples of this integration of culture and heritage, despite the false portrayal that the Muslim rule of Spain was merely an invasion that came and left in obscurity. We can conclude with another example. The Arab ruler of Al-Andalus, Hisham al-Mu'ayyid, was the son of a Basque woman who had converted to Islam. Her name was Subh al-Bashkanchiya. In her native kingdom of Navarre, she was known as Aurora. She was a powerful woman in Al-Andalus, especially since her son was a very young ruler who was influenced by her. If her conversion was insincere, she could have easily manipulated him to the benefit of the Christians of Al-Andalus and in the kingdom of Navarre. She was the one who approved and brought in the ministers, and among them was the de facto ruler, Muhammad ibn Abi Amir al-Hajib al-Mansur, who had continuously fought and defeated the Christian kingdoms in the north. There are many examples like this, but I think we've made our point very clear. The concept of native right to the land is a complex notion that demands a nuanced understanding of history. The history of Spain, like that of many lands, is a tapestry woven with the threads of many cultures, languages, religions, and peoples. The Muslims of Al-Andalus, who thrived in what is now known as Spain and Portugal for nearly 7 centuries, have just as much right to be considered an essential part of Spanish history, just as the Visigoths, the Romans, the Celts, and the Iberians before them. Their contributions to art, science, governance, intellectual exchange during the Islamic period are undeniable. It is through this lens that we can truly appreciate the profound legacy of the Muslims of Al-Andalus and their rightful place in the story of Spain. It is time that we challenge the false narratives and the dishonest portrayals of the Muslims of Spain. Thank you for watching this video, and we hope that you will subscribe and enjoy the many videos that are to come regarding Al-Andalus.